So this morning's scripture reading is the story of David and Goliath. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will stretch you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear. For the battle is in the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank deep into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. The word of God for the people of God. May the Spirit add a blessing for understanding of it. When I was doing some study for the story of David and Goliath, I found it kind of interesting. Because we usually think of that story a little bit on the left, right? The little boy with the sling. I just typed in big man versus little man and came up with that picture there on the left. That's probably the way it felt. But as I was doing some digging, because we've probably all heard the David and Goliath story, at least some point in our life. But I wonder and we all have heard it as kind of the story of the underdog versus the overwhelming opponent, right? The little guy wins. And we all like to relate to that because we all sometimes in our lives consider ourselves the underdog. Or maybe most times in our lives look at ourselves as the underdog. And I was reading a few commentaries and a few sermons and a few studies on this story. I found some interesting things I had never heard. In the story that we heard, in most English translations, they say that Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. That means he was 9 foot 9 inches tall. That comes from what they call the Masoretic text, and that's Old Text. But the oldest manuscripts we have, which are the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the 1st century, and from a historian of the time called Josephus, said that he was 4 cubits and a span. So 6 feet 9 inches. Probably not the 9 foot or almost 10 foot giant that we saw. But the average height of a man back then was about 5'2". So he was a full 1.5 feet taller than anybody else. And they said the numbers got changed from the oldest manuscript to the newest because they figured as the scribes wrote it, the story got exaggerated just a little bit each time. Eventually they kind of fell on that 6 cubits instead of just the 4 cubits, which it doesn't really matter. He was tall. I just thought that was interesting that the oldest texts have it as he was only 6'9". David was known as just a little guy. He was 17, and he probably weighed maybe 125 pounds dripping wet, whereas Goliath's armor itself, just that he wore on his chest, was probably 125 pounds. Some people estimated that all of his armor could have weighed up to 700 pounds. I don't know if that's true. That seems a little ridiculous, even if he was a 6'9" guy, to be able to be walking around with 700 pounds of armor on him. But he was an intimidating fellow. He had a huge sword, he had a javelin or a spear that was like the shaft of a weaver's beam, a giant beam in like a building. And he had an armor bearer that would walk in front of him with a shield that was the size of a full-grown man. No doubt he was intimidating. You could just kind of picture the Israelite army, and who would want to volunteer to fight them? For 40 days, he would walk out to the front of the battle lines and say, "Who fights me? One-on-one, winner takes all." And not a single warrior from Israel stepped up. Saul, King Saul, is the one that probably should have stepped up. He was tall, they say, for his time too, so he was at least close, maybe within a foot of being as tall as Goliath was, but he was too scared to even fight him. So for 40 days, the Philistine taunts Israel, and then here we have little David show up. And he says, "I'll take care of this. God's protecting me from the bear and the lion. He's going to protect me from this Goliath." And then we get our nice little underdog story. But there was a TED Talk, if you've heard of what they are. It was given by Malcolm Gladwell. And he said maybe David wasn't quite the underdog who we thought he was. And I found this quote. I'm not even going to pronounce whose name that is in the bottom. But I like the quote, "Our confidence not in what we have, but he who freely gave us what we have." If it's God's will, your little stones will bring down giant Goliaths, but you have to make the throw. I love the last part of that little quote. God will help you, but you got to make the throw. You have to take the first step. If you're looking for a book to read this summer, there's an older book, but it's by, I believe, Peter Orberg. If you want to walk on water, you got to step out of the boat. Same type of message as that quote. If you want to experience a miracle, God's grace and forgiveness and power, you got to make that throw. Back to the TED Talk. Maybe little David wasn't quite the underdog that we thought. As I talked about, there is no doubt that Goliath was a giant, was a formidable warrior, someone that would be super intimidating. But some biblical scholars question that Goliath had a big weakness. That if he didn't grow so tall, part of the disadvantage of that is that you don't see very well. So they think maybe he was a big warrior, but he couldn't see very good. So all he saw was little David out there and didn't realize the danger that David possessed with his sling. Then we think of David's weapon as a little slingshot, right? When I think of the sling, I think of like a little slingshot the boys have around. I don't know if my boys ever owned a slingshot. A little Y stick, a little rubber band, you can flick things through it. Not super powerful. Enough to break a few windows in your day, maybe kill a bird or a squirrel or something, or knock them out of a tree, but nothing too crazy. But they say that sling that David had the power of a handgun. It was a stick with a long rope tied to it. You would swing it around like this, and that rope was fairly long. And the way you could get the velocity of that would be this equal to the stopping power of a .45 caliber handgun. So it was no child's toy. It was actually a weapon used in some armies at that time. So if you imagine a stone with that kind of power of a handgun hitting someone in the forehead, it's going to do some serious damage, no matter how big they are. So David doesn't show up to this fight as some powerless underdog. In our terms, we look at it and we think, well, there's no chance, right? No chance David beats Goliath. But when God looks at it, God says, you bet there's a chance. Because one of them trusts me, one of them has confidence in me, one of them has the courage to step up and to do what's needed. I'll work this miracle through him. Have you guys ever seen the Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark? Great scene in the movie, right? I don't remember. He's fighting through this crowd when I don't know if his girlfriend, the lady that was with him was taken. And this guy, this big Arab, shows up with a sword. He's doing all these fancy movements with a sword. And Indiana Jones pulls out his gun and shoots him in the head, right? Same story I hear with David and Goliath. So as I said in the children's sermon, what do we draw on when we face the giants in our life? Do we have the courage to face them? Do we have the confidence that the Lord will be with us? Do we have the ability to make the throw? To take the first step? The story of David and Goliath isn't a story about David and his leadership so much. It's a story about God working through David. It's about David being chosen. But he doesn't wave a magic wand or simply utter a prayer and God takes away all of his enemies, all of his giants in front of him. He has to have the courage to stand there. No matter what we read in the Bible, you have to imagine David as a human being scared out of his wits. Having the confidence to stand there, but not really knowing what's going to happen. There's always a chance he misses with that stone. There's always a chance he has to be thinking in the back of the mind, this might not go well. But he still stands there and faces the giant. Scholars even go to say that the description of his armor is almost to be too ridiculous to even be used in battle. To suggest that really Goliath was there just to frighten everybody. Just by the sheer sight of him and all of his armor, no one wants to fight him because he looks so intimidating. But if you really were to fight him, he couldn't do anything with that armor. Wouldn't be able to move, wouldn't hardly be able to do much. And that's a lot of times what our giants are, right? We build them up to be these big things that we can't face or can't fight. When we actually face them and get through them and think, that really wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But we have a choice when we face a challenge. Sometimes we give up before even engaging in the battle. That giant is too intimidating, too powerful, I'll never face it. I don't care what God says to me. I am not willing to take that first step or make that first throw. Misty Copeland was told that she was too short, too old, too curvy to reach the heights of a career as a ballerina. But she worked and became the first African American woman to be named principal ballerina in the American Ballet Theater. You probably all heard the story that Michael Jordan was a freshman. He was put on the JV basketball team. The story turned out pretty good for him at the end. He could have quit and said, it's not worth it. They don't recognize my greatness yet. But before achieving the record for home runs in baseball, Babe Ruth held the record for the most strikeouts. In the Bible, Esther was chosen as queen because she had a pretty face, and they presumed that she'd be more docile than her predecessor, yet she led her people to salvation and prosperity. Moses had a speech impediment, yet served as a prophet that led the Israelites out of Egypt. Elijah, the great prophet, had a panic attack and a mental health crisis, yet recovered and served and mentored his successor. Every story of people facing giants or deciding to step up and be leaders is defined by the nature of the situation. The leader and the way that leader responded to the circumstances. The internal conflict that they had, the external conflict that they faced. And David's story proves that if we have the confidence, the courage, the trust, the preparation, then we can experience that victory. David didn't need anything else but the power of God. He didn't need to be anyone who God created him to be. He was the shepherd, the smallest of Jesse's sons, the one who couldn't even serve in the army. He was home taking care of the sheep. The last person you would have picked to fight that Philistine. And God has a real good habit of that. If if you read through the stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament, of picking who we would call the least qualified. All through the Old Testament, many of those leaders of our faith, you would look at them and say, no chance. They would be the founding fathers of the Christian movement. Jesus picked a bunch of fishermen and tax collectors and poor people to be his disciples. On and on, God proves that all you need is confidence in him. We look at the qualities, the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart and the mind. David decided that he'll fight for God. He certainly wasn't perfect, and he certainly is going to screw up a few times after this. But he knew that he could trust God, and he wasn't afraid to step up and take his shot. So that's a lesson for us through this story of the underdog, or maybe not so much the underdog versus Goliath. Are we willing to have courage, even when we're afraid, to step up and say, I will go through this. I will face this challenge. We have confidence that God will help us. Then do we prepare with that confidence and with God's help, and then trust that God will see us through it. Will we win every victory just the way we want? Of course not. But we can be confident knowing that getting and trusting God will help get us through those trials. That God will see us through, and at the end, maybe we'll look back and see that giant was just some big dummy in a bunch of heavy armor, not nearly as intimidating as he was. But we've got to be willing to trust and to step up and take that throw. If we just sit on the sidelines, we won't experience God's miracles and God's power as powerfully as if we stepped into the arena. I hope we answer that call when God asks us to lead and to fight those giants in our lives. Amen.